Welcome to the Trans-Apocalyptic Oasis Show, where we transcend and include the apocalypse. I am here today with Amiel Handelsman. Is that correct? Did I
You
say that
got
right?
it. Yes,
Perfect.
Marshall.
And he's a fellow member of the tribe, if I understand correctly.
Jewish tribe, yes.
Yeah.
Integral tribe, meta modern tribe.
Yes, but today we have this very special episode where we plot Jewish world domination. So, how are our Jewish space lasers doing at the moment?
They are they were fully powered, but they're on a generator at the moment. The electricity went out, but the generator's working.
Okay, good. So, actually, no, we are here to talk about anti-racism, among other things. And I know you've done some really interesting work in that area, and that you've published some critiques, critiques of what has become sort of conventional anti-racism work. And you've also published some things, some more positive things, like what are some better ways to do this?
Yep.
So I wonder if you might talk about some of the challenges that you see, some of the issues that you see around current discourse about anti-racism and current approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. One way I might frame this is that for the last 25, 30 years, I keep getting older and I forget to add numbers to that. I've been interested in and committed to a couple areas. One is how to support thriving organizations, which also means dealing with a lot of the unhealthy dimensions within organizations. And that's where diversity, equity, and inclusion, which tends to be organizational focused, comes in. And then a second area has been, to use perhaps a lofty term, how to create a better America. Yes, world, but I'm an American citizen. That is my focus. And we have a lot of influence around the world. How to help the country live up to its ideals, mend what's broken, chart a better future. And sometimes these two domains get confused. I look at them as separate. And that's because as somebody who is an executive coach doing leadership development in organizations, it's very clear when the conversation is about how do we help this organization do better. And that's different, overlapping, but different from how do we create a better America, better democracy, where everyone can thrive, or at least where, as I like to say, everyone can have a minimally decent life, which I will want to say more about that later. So these have been two big domains for me that have been of interest, as I said, for 25 or 30 years. And then after the murder of George Floyd, which is really just one of the recent awakenings, there's been a lot of conversation, tension, conflict, and debate. And so I have been participating in that debate. I'm not a newcomer to it. I am someone who's learning and attempting to say, what are the partial truths in each perspective, and how can we supplement them with other perspectives that will help us together produce better outcomes?
Gotcha. Yeah. So I've noticed the thing you're talking about where, some DEI activists will look at an organization, they'll see that there maybe isn't as much representation of people of color, blacks and people of color. And then there's this presumption that, well, this must be systemic racism. And they sort of take this lens, which they, through which they look at the whole country, and they see the issues of racism, the issues around racism that have plagued the country for a while. And then they just sort of, it's like the wrong scale. They're applying that lens to organizations. So what do you see as the overlap between those things, if there is any, in terms of like because there's this like disparity thing, this fallacy where anytime you see a disparity in terms of demographic representation, there's that presumption of racism. So I'm wondering, I'd like to hear you say more about that.
Yeah, let me start with the first part, which is where's the overlap? And this will be rather obvious, but one overlap is that the same human beings that are working in organizations focused on the organization are also citizens, or at least residents of a country. And those who are in the United States are citizens or residents of the United States. And so they're the same people. And in the last few years, a much higher percentage of people who work in organizations, which is a few hundred million people, have been highly tuned into politics, much more than 20 years ago. And partly that's because of it's been a crazy, tense time the last bunch of years, and also because you have a millennial generation that, for a variety of reasons, is tuning in a certain way. So because we are the same human beings, whether we're on the job or off the job, if we are really tuned into some of the larger societal challenges, then they can come into the organization with us. We can choose whether or not to do that. So that's, one way to answer the overlap, is it comes in just in the form of human beings living their lives. Now, as I think the second area you mentioned was one approach of some DEI activists of saying, because this has been true in the country as a whole, it must be, or likely is true, in this software company or environmental organization or public high school
or spiritual school.
And I think, just logically speaking, it's foolish to ever assume because something is true here, it's true there. It's worth having as a hypothesis. And
Sure.
there may be grounding to that assessment, meaning the presence of discrimination, prejudice, exclusion in an organization isn't a fact you can verify. It's an assessment you can ground with evidence or not. And so part of the challenge is that when we have people making ungrounded assessments and stirring things up, it can create a lot of mischief. Now, in some cases, there is prejudice and discrimination. But when you take such a wide swath of accusation, as sometimes occurs, then you actually create a lot of enemies and a lot of people who could have been allies who think that they're being attacked. And I want to just take a quick step back, Marshall, because in some of my writing, when I've talked about DEI, I've talked about three things: healthy DEI, that's healthy but suboptimal; unhealthy DEI; and then unhealthy attacks on DEI. They're all present. And you're asking me about this, the second category, unhealthy DEI, but I want to acknowledge there have been people doing diversity and inclusion work for decades to varying degrees of success who have not been leading with accusation or shame. They've been attempting to create more demographic representation is one area, sometimes through the law, sometimes simply through company policies around recruitment and promotion. they've been second of all attempting to create an environment where people actually feel included rather than just being physically included. And so there's been good work done in this area. But where it's been suboptimal is that you get a lot of excitement, as often happens in organizations, about some initiative. People get engaged, and then it kind of falls flat, and people lose energy for it. And then a lot of, why do we do this? What's the point? And then the cycle repeats itself. And if you talk to longtime D&I practitioners, they'll tell you about this. That's different from this recent wave, just really the last few years, of this hardcore ideological activism. And I wouldn't want to tarnish the brush of the unhealthy stuff onto the earlier group. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you see as the cause of this latest wave of sort of rigid ideology, and also there seems to be a disconnect from reality, like in terms of distorted, exaggerated narratives about, the extent of racism and so on and so forth?
Well, we can explain it generationally, as many have done, that the millennial generation, which by definition is rather young, I don't know the age range, but let's say they haven't reached the peak of their maturity in life, for those of us who believe that adults can mature, that they have been leading the way. And even some of the next generation, people in their mid-20s, early 20s, college students. So part of it is you have a lot of pressure coming from a young group that developmentally can be well suited to right-wrong thinking, right? To a certain,
I hear you there.
looking at the world that's very narrow, that hasn't developed the capacity to take on different perspectives and hold them at once. And that group of that generation, we'll say some portion of that generation, is then latching on to some fairly sophisticated, let's call them progressive postmodern ideas that in themselves aren't necessarily unhealthy. In fact, in some cases, they're quite healthy and useful. But we might say hijacking them from a right-wrong thinking mind. And then you're either a believer or you're a not believer. And it's because of that that I was recently at a conference last summer with a man who grew up in China, who the extreme versions of this reminded him of China during the Cultural Revolution.
Maoism.
And more. So a lot of this can be explained by a generation coupled with a certain developmental action logic or way of holding things that is very, very binary. And so, as somebody who's into helping people develop, the answer is to create scaffoldings for everybody to mature, including me and you, which we're both obviously very much in the middle of.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm already done developing. I've reached the zenith. But no, I'm actually a millennial. I'm like an early millennial.
Oh, it's you're the one.
It's my fault.
Who's actually been responsible for this.
I'm sorry.
You've been shooting your so-called Jewish space lasers at the other millennial generation.
I've been trying, man.
How old are you?
I just turned 40.
Oh, happy birthday. I'm 52, almost 53.
So
I'm a Gen Xer.
I'm like early millennial, sometimes called a zennial, because it's like we're part Gen X, part millennial.
Okay.
So I can sort of bridge both worlds. There's also this so a couple things you said were interesting to me. One of them was about it's like there are these postmodern theories that are they have a lot of explanatory power and they have value, but they're sort of being co-opted by a lower stage of development and put into very, rigid binary moralistic terms, fundamentalist terms. And so this gets into like a common misconception that this is a green movement, that this whole like diversity and inclusion movement or anti-racism movement is a green movement. And green is just like going around wreaking havoc, flattening all the hierarchies and so on and so forth. Or inverting them even. And that's just not true. And I think a lot of like genuine greens are just sort of mortified by, by a lot of what is essentially amber with green values.
Yes.
So that's a common misconception. And then but then what is this thing about inverting hierarchies, like overturning them? That is like, where does that come from?
Well, let me go back to one thing.
That's kind of a Marxist thing, right? Okay, go ahead.
I'm not an expert at Marxism, but one way I might say it slightly differently is just to bring in another line of development, the Kegan framework, which is that you have a lot of us. I'm not saying I'm one of them, but I like to say a lot of us Americans who are centered in the socialized mind, where we hear a perspective and we take it in, and that becomes who we are. So if I'm 20, 25 years old and I'm really centered in the socialized mind, and then I hear this worldview that is could be a green worldview, let's just say, or progressive worldview, and then I take it in and I believe in it and I don't think of it, and then yes, I can have that right wrong thinking, particularly when in a stressful environment. And this is where the compassionate part of me comes out, which is that it's challenging to be I'm just going to talk about that generation, to be in your late teens, early 20s. We all went through it. We were all immature in our own ways. When my generation, when we were in that, I would say it was a different form of immaturity. It was maybe more of a modernist immaturity. But each person, it's a huge generation we're talking about. But what I'm trying to say is, with climate change, with political polarization, there's a lot of stresses on people, and that makes it hard without necessary support to grow. And so you have a lot of people who are kind of fixated. And one of the forms of fixation, just to get back to your question, has to do with taking down hierarchies. Now, what in particular are you pointing to, Marshall?
Well, I mentioned that it's Marxist, and I want to be really careful here, because there's this tendency on the right to smear anything that's not right-wing thought as like Marxist. But there's a certain kind of like mythic architecture within Marxist thought, where it's like we have these two classes, and this is more Hegelian. The whole like master and slave thing, like the whole
oppressor oppressed.
Oppressor and oppressed. So that sort of frame comes from Hegel, and Marx sort of applied it to like economics. And he identified these two classes, the bourgeois and the proletariat. And obviously one class was oppressing, the other class. And his prescription was overthrow. right? To invert the hierarchy, to establish what he called a bloody dictatorship of the proletariat. And so he was okay with oppression as long as it was the poor, the working class oppressing the middle class. So yeah, it's like, and then that kind of inversion of hierarchies, it sort of persists today. It's like there's this desire now to take white people out of power, for example, and to put people of color in their place. There is some of that. So that's really what I was talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, another example of that might be a phrase that from Kendi, Ibram X. Kendi, that a lot of people quote, and I'm paraphrasing it, but it's something to the effect of the answer to past discrimination is present discrimination.
Yeah.
Going in the other direction. And then the goal being equity. And that's where, in an organizational level, it used to be diversity and inclusion. And then we put the word equity in, which means lots of things to different people.
Yeah.
So I guess one way I want to answer this good question is to just take a step back and ask, what are we shooting for? What's the aspiration here? When we get into these ideological distinctions, it's easy to forget, well, what world are we attempting to create? Like, what's the purpose of that? And so I want to just share one view of mine that is important to me, and that's the notion of a minimally decent life. A minimally decent life means that if you think about the basic physical, material, and emotional and psychological needs, because we care about the outer and the inner, that there is a floor, threshold beyond which everybody gets to be. A floor.
Yeah.
So in the physical realm, it's food, reasonably healthy food, reliable. It's warmth. It's a shelter. On an interior level, it's love, connectedness, some degree of status, some degree of autonomy. Now I'm getting into the brain needs from brain science. So you have these sort of basic needs that everyone needs to have a minimally decent life. And I think most of us here can acknowledge that not everybody has that. Like, if we could just agree to that and say, let's get everyone up to that level. Where I think this inversion of hierarchies is going is saying, let's have everyone be at the same level. That's not my goal. I don't know that that's a worthy goal. I don't know if that's achievable. And in fact, if you look at societies through history, you're never going to find that. I recently dipped into a thinker that I basically have avoided reading for a long time, Thomas Sowell. I'll hold up his book, Intellectuals and Race.
Yes.
And I'm just a chapter or two into the book, but basically what he's saying in the book is that in the early 20th century, different outcomes amongst what we might call Black identified Americans and white identified Americans were due to biology. That was the consensus. It was a racist view related to eugenics, studies of skulls that supposedly told you someone's intelligence or inner character. I mean, a bunch of baloney. That was the consensus in the early 20th century amongst a group of intellectuals. Now, 100 years later, in his writing, the general consensus is that it's due to, in the United States, these differences are due to discrimination. And what he does in the first chapter of this book that I'm finding quite provocative is he goes through all these different societies and cultures in history and shows the inequalities present and asks, does the presence of inequality by itself mean it's due to discrimination? Now, I might want to go into those and say, Well, sir, actually, in these cases, maybe that was part of it, as it is today. But what he's attempting to do is to say, let's not form a conclusion before we gather evidence for it.
Right.
Let's also not form the conclusion that there isn't ongoing prejudice and racism present in our society and in our organizations. Maybe we could be curious and attentive and present to these things. So just to connect that back to my prior thought, if you let go of the idea that every group, all these groups need to be equal with each other, there's always going to be an imbalance, and start with, God, could we just ensure everybody has access to food and water and shelter and love, and like make that our focus? Some of these other things, some of these ideologies would not be particularly persuasive. So there's something to pass back to you.
How do we guarantee love for everybody?
Guaranteeing is tough. How about raising the odds?
I gotcha. And that's a whole can of worms, you know?
That's like, a lot of cans of worms.
It's like there are differences in outcomes between different demographic groups. And that's a very complex situation, you know? It's like it even gets into prenatal nutrition.
Absolutely. Prenatal nutrition and prenatal care. I mean, there's so many factors that go in. Let's just say it's a complex problem, which means you can't identify cause and effect. It's too complex to do that. And so here's where these simplistic solutions harm the very cause that they're aiming for. So if the aim is to improve the lives of Black identified Americans, let's say between the ages of 15 and 25, just to pick one group, the goal is to improve those lives. And if all we focus on are so-called racial differences, number one, we're missing a lot of what's going on, right? So we're not attending to those. But second of all, we're creating a political platform that turns off so many people. And if the goal is to build a constituency for improving lives, then maybe it's smart. And the Biden administration did this. I mean, they did some across the board support. I think it's the child tax credit that had 1/3 of the kids that were in poverty were no longer in poverty. And now they need to extend it for that to continue. There's nothing about Black or white in there, but everybody benefits. Now, I'm not saying every single policy needs to be that way, but if you look at things so narrowly through a racial lens, you're missing a lot of opportunities to do better, and you're turning off a lot of potential supporters. And so that's where it helps to grow into a little appreciation for complexity.
Right. Yeah. And this is actually why real Marxists don't like the sort of racial lens, because they see it as undermining class solidarity. And like a lot of these issues are not really about racism, they're about class, economic class.
Absolutely. Not everything, but a lot of, and even if they aren't caused that way, the question is, how do you improve them? And there's a word, I'm forgetting what this is, but it's that, and this is not Einstein, I'm not going to quote Einstein's consciousness thing, but when you're looking at problems, that the way you got in doesn't necessarily dictate the way out. In other words, if the way in to wealth inequality between Black identified and white identified Americans, and at some point we'll have to talk about why I'm using those terms, if the path in had something to do with unequal access to housing loans and to home ownership and a variety of other factors, that's the way in. That doesn't mean that that's the way out, right?
Right.
Really, the point is, how do we ensure a minimally decent life for everybody, and then also provide opportunity, right? And that, so again, just like trying to reverse what's happened doesn't necessarily even work.
Yeah. So,
and that's where you were talking about the true Marxists being unhappy with this. There's I'm forgetting the name of Touré Reed. His father, I think it was Adolph Reed, was a sort of a Marxist or neo-Marxist thinker. Anyways, Touré Reed wrote this fascinating book that simultaneously critiqued Barack Obama and the author of the famous Atlantic article about reparations, Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? Who were quite different politically, right? One might say, and basically went after both of them for underemphasizing solutions to wealth disparity. And I thought it was a fascinating case that starts with the premise of how do we make people's lives better? I'm just going to keep saying that because it's so easy to get distracted. If the goal is to combat racism, well, what if we could make people's lives better in a way that has nothing to do with combating racism? Would you support it? I would.
Well, I don't know. That sounds like you trying to sneak in colorblind racism.
Colorblindness is another topic. You tell me if you want to get into that.
I mean, we could. You mentioned Ta-Nehisi Coates, and that sort of brings in this idea of progress denialism, that starting with Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, there's this sort of cynical framing of the civil rights movement as this. It's sort of like the bare minimum that white people were willing to do in order to create the illusion that they're trying to make things less racist, when actually they're just really trying to hold on to their power. And so that's not seen as progress. That's seen at the civil rights movement was framed as status quo.
Yeah, I have to admit I'm only lightly read Kimberly Crenshaw. I'm somewhat aware of the origins of intersectionality, which is misunderstood in the way it's been appropriated, and almost nothing with Derek Bell. But the question of progress, has there been progress? How do we assess the civil rights movement is a very important question. And here's where we get into it's also an interesting challenge in terms of how to teach history, right?
Yes.
So one way to look at today is to say, gosh, as I said, we're not meeting the needs of a lot of folks for a minimally decent life. And our democracy is severely impaired right now, right? And prejudice and discrimination still exist. And we have white supremacists on the march, etc. And to say, as Isabel Wilkerson says in her book, Caste, these are echoes of the past. Echoes, not equal to echoes. Yes. Echoes, while acknowledging, thank you for embodying that, bringing us back to the body. Okay, while acknowledging, I'm sorry, this is not the world of 1860, 1875, 1960. It is a very different world. So it's one thing to point to, God, the suffering that exists, the injustice even, and to say, and there's been progress. And yet it's another thing to say, and there's echoes, to say, things are really bad and they've never really gotten better. And you'll see it in the language where it's almost as though you can't tell whether someone's talking about it being, whether we're in the years of slavery or whether we're in 2023. And I just want to say,
1950s.
1950s, when you hear people speak, it's almost as though time has been suspended. And Timothy Snyder, the historian at Yale, refers to this, looking at the right wing, as a politics of eternity. It's the politics of Putin and Mr. Trump, where the past and the present are kind of all mixed together. And this is maybe a separate point we don't want to go down. But when you hear Putin speak, he speaks about Ukraine as though it's the 1940s or before, or thousands, like no time has passed. And so you see the same thing in this thread of anti-racism, as though there's been no progress. And that is problematic for a lot of ways, isn't it?
Yeah, and you see it show up in a lot of places, like not just the framing of the civil rights movement, but also you've got the 1619 Project, which is it's attempting to sort of redefine the entire origin and character of this country. Right there, yes, you got 13th, that whole documentary, which is attempting to reframe the 13th Amendment as simply a way to, turn blacks back into slaves, but through incarceration. And then you've also have attempts to reframe the Rockefeller drug laws, which led to greater black incarceration as, just more systemic racism. And all of these things are attempts to revise history in order to make things look like there has been no progress.
Yeah, you mentioned a few different things, and I want to at least address one of them, which is the 1619 Project, and maybe take a slightly different perspective than you on it, because I'm doing a deep dive on it. And I think the title of the 1619 Project and the framing of it in the opening essay in New York Times Magazine by, and now I'm forgetting her name, the New York Times reporter who created this. The basic premise is that the founding, the country wasn't founded in 1776. It was founded in 1619. And it's best understood that slavery was kind of the cause and origins of the country. And so if someone were to go, well, slavery was very significant, but is it everything? And are you going to say that there was no noble promise and nothing special about the founding of the country? That's a reasonable critique, right? But I do want to defend a lot of this book.
Go right ahead.
Because I think there were 10 original essays, and the book has something like 20 chapters. So they added a bunch. And her tone in the opening chapter is somewhat similar, but she's modified it. And what they've done is they've included more evidence of Black identified Americans practicing agency rather than just being acted upon. And, even there's a chapter on the contributions to democracy by one of the authors in there, which is an important part of history to teach. So, and there's also some really important history that you might call the injustice side, that if all you read it was that chapter, you would not conclude that the only reason the United States was created was to defend slavery. So I do want to say that if you get into the weeds of the book and you get into the chapters, it's a wonderful book. It's a wonderful book. And there's even a chapter for an author who's into deracialization, Dorothy Roberts, which is a big passion of mine. And I was like, wow, I was not expecting to see that in there. So the 1619 Project, yes, the title and the original premise and essay, really problematic, but let's embrace the partial truths. And frankly, I mean, there's so much to add to the history that a lot of us have been taught, but let's not get caught in all aboutism. This is a term I want to introduce, not
all aboutism.
What aboutism? We know what that means. That means, yeah, I did this bad thing, but what about this other person who did this bad thing? Allaboutism is a term which I think I invented, which is if there's such and such challenge, it's all about one thing. The founding of the country was all about slavery. Inequality in society is all about, quote unquote, race, and so on and so forth. Allaboutism says everything is just one thing, and I'm going to ignore all other dimensions of reality. And so the antidote to allaboutism is this approach of supplementing perspectives with other perspectives, something that you and I are very interested in. And we can do that with the 1619 project. We can take a lot of the rich history and stories and poems in here and supplement it and make sure that we honor the beautiful principles of the founding of the country, however imperfectly achieved.
Gotcha. Okay. So you mentioned deracialization, which is an interesting topic. And I know you're into Albert Murray's Omni-American, the Omni-American project, which is really quite fascinating. I recall reading an article about it a few years ago, and he basically says that, we all, even people that identify as white, there's some black, culture mixed in there, especially I'm just thinking of an example of like music. The contributions of African Americans to music that pretty much, many, if not most, or people who identify as white have come to appreciate. And everybody that identifies as black, there's some whiteness in there, and it's like the American identity is a mix of both. And so I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, thank you. We might say it's composite, it's a mix, it's an intermingling. And this is culture. You're using the word white and black. What he's referring to are the cultural forms that different groups of people have invented and been influenced by. So first, I just want to credit the person who introduced me to all this, which is Greg Tomas, who's a fellow integralist who many listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with. He introduced me to Albert Murray, and I was immediately intrigued because it was a total breath of fresh air. And his book was 1970.
Yeah.
But it felt just as topical today. So he introduced me to Albert Murray. And a couple things to say about that. One is that culture, and Greg is really a wonderful spokesperson for this, but you're getting at the gist here on culture is that culture is an intermingling. We're constantly learning from each other. And music, like jazz, even just jazz, for example, if you look at, if you watch Ken Burns' series on jazz or read anything about the history of jazz, you have people with many different skin cultures and subcultures influencing each other. Hearing a particular style and saying, I want to try that, right? Or any of us who try out different types of food. It's like, that influences me. And of course, today hip hop as a cultural form has influenced a whole generation in terms of speech, movement, style, mood, for better, in some cases for worse. I really prefer hip hop of 20 to 30 years ago, but that's or early rap to today's stuff, but that's a different topic. Part of his story was just to acknowledge that if you look at people, not just their skin color, but the cultures we inhabit, that it's a big mix. But the other dimension to it is that, if you look at the genealogy of so-called Black identified Americans, it's a mix. It's a mix, including people who've identified as white. And, for a lot of reasons, I don't need to get into the details of all that. And skin colors vary tremendously amongst so-called whites and so-called blacks. And the other part of it, which I'm not sure that Murray really gets into, but Tomas pulled me into, is that there really are no 5 or 6 distinct, biologically, genetically distinct races. And we could talk about that for a while. It's a big passion of mine, but it's just a fallacy. We use the word race as though it exists. But once you explain to people the history of race and what it actually means, a lot of folks will say, yeah, I'm not sure I really identify with that. But what I really mean by race is my cultural group or my ancestry. I call that race as culture, race as ancestry, which are different. Or what I really mean by race is, let's talk about discrimination and inequality and injustice. But I can talk about that without believing they're biological races. I call that race as topic. So you have race as topic, race as culture, race as ethnicity, which I say I'm all for. Let's do this. Then there's race as biological classification, which the anthropologists said in the 1950s was baloney. Front page, New York Times. And then the geneticists through the Human Genome Project said, we also agree. On a genetic level, race has no meaning whatsoever. Yet in our day-to-day life, we talk about it as though there's some there, and there really isn't. So I think that was an intuition of Albert Murray that maybe he didn't lay out in quite the way that I'm doing, but that was present in his work.
Gotcha. Yeah, I just pulled up the article and I want to read this this statement from him. I mean, he said American culture is a composite that is part Yankee, part backwoodsman and Indian, and part Negro. And he said, by any definition of race, even the most makeshift legal one, most native-born U.S. Negroes, far from being non-white, are in fact part white. None of this is really news. And yet, it is perhaps the second most persistently overlooked flesh and blood fact of everyday life in the United States. The first, of course, is the all but unmentionable but equally undeniable fact that an infinite and ever increasing but forever hidden number of assumed white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are, among other parts, part Negro. Mm-hmm. And I guess what was he referring to, like genetically or something like that, biologically? But when I read that, I assumed he was talking about culturally.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know. It was at least culturally, although I think he also liked to use the term miscegenation, which was kind of use race in a racist fashion of, so-called blacks and whites, having sex and having babies. But he kind of appropriated it and used it kind of in a joking way, which is sort of part of his style, and said, yeah, there's a lot of people have been producing offspring together that are quote unquote mixed. And I just do want to acknowledge that notion of American is part this, part that comes from Constance Rourke. I think her book is American Humor. So he cites her and he pulls that from her. Now, an important part of that is let's just acknowledge this is actually really big, because there's this narrative that there's America and then there's Black America, that there's white American history and then there's Black American history, and this is Black History Month, as though they're separate. And one of the reasons that narrative exists is to make the argument that we need to pay attention to all the exclusion that has happened, right? The mistake of saying that, and it's another one of these binaries, there's white American, there's Black America. He's saying there's an America that everyone has contributed to, and Black Americans have contributed to it as much as anyone else. Like it's like a grounded assessment and point of pride for him even though he's talking about Omni-Americans, which sounds like it's like means there's no particularism. No, it's the particular and the universal. Omni-American. You bring along your own particular culture and its contribution to the larger culture, and that you do that with pride and with accuracy. And so it's a very important,
very integral. You know, it's like a whole on.
It is a whole on, and it's the particular and the
it's
universal. It's also polarity.
Or holarchical rather than hierarchical.
I would say it's a polarity as well. It's a polarity, it's a synthesis. And yeah, you might think of him as kind of proto-integral in some ways, but I just want to, anytime we hear white culture and black culture, it's worth wondering, what do you mean by that?
It's a good question, because like, you know, what it has meant to be white has historically excluded certain groups of people who have white skin, you know, and I'm thinking of the Irish, for example. And then there's the peculiar case of the Ashkenazi, which 23andMe,
Jewish, just so not everyone knows that term.
Yeah, well, Ashkenazi Jews.
Yeah.
Which is a particular class or kind of Jew that right. 23andMe taught me had to do with some Jews from the Middle East coming over to Europe and, you know, mating with Europeans, yes, and creating this sort of hybrid, you know, Middle Eastern Jews slash European new kind of creature. And so it's like, well, are we white, you know, like and that's always also an interesting question, because it's right, like people will say, well, you're passable, and so you get to benefit from white privilege and all that. But I also know that, like, you know, once the fascist right takes over, they're going to put me on a train to the camp, you know, and it doesn't matter how I look.
Yes, I prefer to say if they take over.
Yeah, I know.
But that is also, those are both true. Like I believe there is a white skin privilege. There's a lot of social science research behind that. And also, yeah, the neo-Nazis and revitalized Klan folks, they really don't care that you have white privilege. They care that you're Jewish. And this is where there's a lot of, if we want to talk about this for a minute, because it's an important topic, where the ideology of oppression oppressor trips itself up and is a bit confused, which is that if somebody is generally doing well socioeconomically, as American Jews have done on average, now Oak Park, Michigan, outside of Detroit, is, last I checked, not an upper middle class neighborhood, and there's a lot of Jews. There's a lot of working class, and there's a lot of Hasidic Jews who are not making a lot of money, and they're having a lot of babies. Okay, let's just acknowledge that. But on the whole, so you have a, you know, relatively well off, kind of like the Indian American population is kind of becoming, you know, relatively well off, and you could say that about, you know, Nigerian immigrants and others. But that because of that, you got all the power and you got nothing to worry about. But that's not how anti-Semitism works. It's punching up. It's saying there are these people who are controlling the world. They're diabolical. They have all this wealth and power, and we got it. And they're letting blacks and so-called blacks and women cut in line. This is the American version. Everyone's in line for the American dream. And how could you explain, if women are inferior and black Americans are inferior, how can you explain that they're getting jobs and getting ahead? The Jews must have let them cut in line. I mean, that's the ideology. So that's where this oppressor-oppressed thing falls down and contributes to anti-Semitism. and also isn't logical historically. Unfortunately, brief historical rant, we Americans are not good historians. We're forward-looking, a lot of beautiful things about our country, but we're very forward-looking, and we're not very interested in our own history, and we don't look at other people's history. But seriously, all you have to do is look at, just for one example, German Jews. What was the situation with German Jews? A lot of them consider themselves more German than Jewish. They were fully integrated. A lot of them were well off, and that didn't keep them from getting murdered. All you got to know is that, and you stop applying this oppressed thing to Jews. It's just, you got to expand the framework to include reality, right? That's kind of what you're saying, Marshall.
Yeah, we have to. So we have to use our Jewish space lasers to like brainwash people to stop hating Jews, basically.
Well, the thing about Jews is that we not only control the space lasers, but apparently we also control all the people who are opposed to space lasers.
Oh,
We're the capitalists and the Marxists.
Controlled opposition.
It's always whatever's happening.
Controlled opposition.
Must have something.
Stalin created these anti-Stalin groups in order to attract people and, in order to control the opposition. Brilliant. So, and now we have Jewish space balloons,
I didn't hear that there was a,
I mean, they're not in space, but those balloons are obviously Jewish.
Yeah, it's actually a bit hard cognitively. I want to apply a little, what's the word, acceptance or patience for most Americans who are not Jewish or who don't understand. It's sort of like the Hollywood thing. Hollywood is disproportionately Jewish, and we ought to be able to say that in a neutral, grounded assessment and be able to say, well, executives in Hollywood, Jews are what percentage of the American population? I don't even know, 0.5%. And they're 10, 30, whatever percent, 50%, 20% in Hollywood. Just factually, yeah, that's correct. But what that doesn't mean that, number one, is the Jews in Hollywood are all collaborating with each other deliberately.
Yeah.
Just because you're in Hollywood doesn't mean you're collaborating. Frankly, a lot of them are probably stabbing each other in the back.
They hate each other.
They fucking hate each other. And second of all, it's a stretch to say that once you think that they're collaborating with each other, they're doing it for their own purposes, to further the agenda of the Jews or of multicultural agenda. That is a stretch, but we have to have some ability. We have to have some ability to say, yeah, like, it's disproportionate. Okay. And then what meaning do you want to make out of that? Right. And the same thing is true with, poverty. We can say, well, gee, Black identified Americans are disproportionately represented amongst the poor. They're not a majority, but they're so what meaning do we make out of that? Do we blame it on their genetics, some supposed race? Do we blame it on discrimination? Or do we say, this is complex?
Yeah. So complexity is the answer.
Yeah, what's Jeopardy? What's the question? If complexity is the answer, what's the question?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, you had mentioned something about the hero's journey.
Love the hero's journey and heroine's journey, just to acknowledge it's both sexes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That heroin addicts also have their own kind of.
That's a different journey. There's hero, heroine, and then heroine.
But you were talking about that within the context of like the Black experience, or Black American and Jewish American experience.
Oh yeah. Yeah, this is Albert Murray, and this is Greg Thomas, and this is Ralph Ellison, and others. It's just a really affirming reframe. And
What are we reframing? That what?
We're reframing that the story of history is a story of oppression, and that the story of Black Americans can be fully summarized by that oppression. That's it's all aboutism. You want to know about what has influenced friends of mine who are Black Americans? It's all about being victimized in oppression.
Yeah.
And so what we do though is we don't say that isn't important. We say, yeah, that's part of the story.
Yeah, and that's part of the hero's journey. Those are the trials and tribulations.
Those are the trials and tribulations. And Albert Murray has a couple great things. He says, you can't have a dragon slayer unless you have a dragon. And he actually applies this. In other words, you need challenge. And he even applies this to his own life. He was adopted, and there is a notion that if you don't come from a certain type of healthy, intact family, you're adopted or you have a single mother, that's that guarantees oppression and misery. And he says, well, there are actually a lot of people who that was their dragon and they slayed it. That was the challenge that they overcame. Ditto for growing up in poverty or with physical and mental abuse. These things are real. They're horrendous. We have practices to deal with trauma, right? And there's a journey here that and I just want to say, with the Black American experience, I was that so resonated with me because it's part of the truth. And you have to, we talk about dignity and disaster. There's the disaster of history and there's the dignity. Some people will say, Marshall, you're emphasizing the hero's journey. Clearly, you're overlooking the brutality and the dehumanization. And my response to that is, no, we start with the brutality and dehumanization. That is the condition in which the hero's journey begins.
Yeah. While also recognizing that there's a lot to be done to give everybody a minimally decent life, which is sort of the basic requirement for having a hero's journey. For having the capacity to actually to travel that journey instead of staying stuck in the impoverishment and brutality.
Right. Because you couldn't, thank you. That's really great. Because you could interpret the hero's journey through the up from the bootstraps story, where it's a view of the role of government in society, which everyone's on their own. And go do your hero's journey. And what we're saying is, no, there's a hero's journey. And part of my hero's journey is supporting, policies in a culture that provides the scaffoldings of support that help people to grow materially on an interior level. We got to have those scaffoldings to support people in that journey. And, it's such a ridiculous thing that a lot of folks who think they've made it on their own. And you go, well, what about that GI Bill that your dad used to go through college? And what about that federal housing loan that your parents used to buy their first home. And what about the government that paid for the electricity that allowed the southern United States and so on? And it's like, oh, well, that doesn't really count. That's just what is. No, that's not what is. That was human beings making choices, right,
Yeah,
Marshall?
those are the structures and the systems. That's the lower right.
Lower right quadrant. So there's so many ways of misinterpreting Albert Murray and what you and I are saying. And so it's almost like we have to continue. There's counter stories. Counter stories is a notion from Howard Gardner. Howard Gardner, who's known for multiple
intelligences.
Yes, but he's also written a series of books around leadership and storytelling, changing minds, leading minds. And he says that if you're a leader and you're attempting to tell a story of the future, which we're trying to do here, right? It's very important to pay attention to the counter stories in your listeners and directly address them. So anytime we talk about the hero's journey or the Omni-American, it's very important to say, and there is the history of brutality, and we need structures and policies and supports, and discrimination still exists, and like, because that addresses, now that won't satisfy everybody, but it helps.
Yeah, I just looked that up. That's really interesting. He talks about resistance stories, and they challenge the status quo.
Yes.
And then you've got counter stories, which are new stories, stories that build on resistance stories and counter the stock stories. So I really like that because it's like a grown-up resistance story.
That's interesting. That's a different interpretation than I was giving, but he may have updated his thinking from when I read the book. So that's taking counter stories related to resistance.
I don't actually know if it's his. I just looked up.
Oh, counter stories.
I looked up counter story, and here's what it says. It's a framework developed at Barnard College. There are four types of stories.
Okay, that's a different framework.
Okay. This one says, yeah, stock stories, concealed stories. They're the hidden ones.
Something new. Yeah. Yeah.
Then there's the resistance stories, and then there's the counter stories. Which builds on resistance and counters the stock story.
Well, just if I could go back to Howard Gardner, he talks about the unschooled mind. And what he's really talking about is a socialized mind or prior, and talking about what a high percentage of the population operates from that mind. And as a leader, it's important to be aware of such people, but don't construct your story to perfectly fit the unschooled mind. Give people what they want, where, the job is to stretch. So we were talking about the Omni-American vision. I don't know if you want to talk more about that or go somewhere else. Tell me.
Yeah, let's, we have a little bit of time left. So there was one thing I was really interested about. You've got you got a new mixtape dropping soon about mob proofing the citizenry and preventing political violence. So say more about that, and like what got you interested in that, and sort of like some of the high level ideas and influences.
Right. Yeah. I haven't published this. In fact, all I've done is draft it. But mob proofing the citizenry, the roots of that most recently are the January 6th attack on the Capitol, as the act that I'm still making sense of. A lot of us are still making sense of it. And then the interpretation of that act that I write about comes from, and I hope I have her pronunciation right, Lene Rachel Andersen, who is the author of a series of books, Bildung, Meta-Modernity. She has a new one called Libertism, and she was the co-author of The Nordic Secret.
Oh, right.
Although I believe she actually wrote most of it, according to her co-author, Tomas Björkman. Anyway, she's a brilliant writer. Every year or two. I have a writer that I just fall in love with their ideas and read everything I can of theirs. So Timothy Snyder is an example from recent years. So she has written that, wasn't writing specifically about January 6th, but about political violence. And she has written quite a bit about Bob Kegan and his model, and using it to understand why Scandinavian countries developed 100, 150 years ago. That's the Nordic secret. But then looking at it today. And anyways, the basic equation is this. If you give people political freedom and you don't have self-authoring minds, you get violence. Right? Political freedom minus self-authoring minds equals violence. And here's why. Because you have self-sovereign minds, which is one way of saying the stage before the socialized mind. And I'm not going to go into detail. We don't have a lot of time. I'm going to assume listeners are aware of this, but this is the mind that is at its kind of peak at age 10. I have a 10-year-old, where what you care about is yourself, your own interests, your own needs, and you can't really internalize anyone else's interests. And it's sort of I want what I want. And so this is the kind of adults who are centered here. When they get upset, they go to violence, right? Not really concerned about others. Then you have socialized minds who—
What was that one called?
Well, one term is called the self-sovereign mind.
Okay, I'm
Kegan has a
seeing
different term.
imperial mind.
Imperial mind is Kegan's term. I think self-sovereign might be Jennifer Garvey Berger's.
Okay.
That maybe I falsely attributed to Kegan. My apologies to both. And then Andersen has a term called big kid mind, which I like that, because you have adults, some of whom were recently president, who are centered in the imperial self-sovereign big kid mind. Anyway, so they're the ones who instigate the violence. Then you have the socialized minds on the mall in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, who are like, I think I'm going to go along with this. Like, yeah, I'm going to go along with this. And some of them only walked so far, but some of the people who were violent, you know, were probably socialized minds.
Socialized minds, yeah.
Not where, right. And that's a very important stage of development. But what's missing are self-authoring minds. And so this is complex and it requires more explanation than maybe we have time for. But the basic premise is, if we want to prevent more January 6th, there's an interior bit of work for us to do that takes a lot of time and requires a lot of scaffoldings, which is to grow more self-authoring minds, so that you have people who either don't protest, or if they're in the crowd, they can steer people in a different direction. That's like the premise of that article and the premise of her work that I just found, wow, this makes really a lot of sense. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. And you're reminding me of Jordan Peterson, actually, who he had this self-authoring program. And I guess he saw this as like the thing that everybody needs. And I don't know if he was inspired by Kegan or not. I mean, he is a clinical psychologist, but yeah, he had this strong emphasis on self-authoring for a while.
And this is a big area of focus in the adult development community. Now, there are a lot of integralists and metamodernists who don't have anything to do with the adult development community. And what I mean by the adult development community are people, a lot of them are coaches and consultants, and to some degree academics, who are very focused on individual and team development. And you've got thought leaders in this space, like Kegan, Lisa Leahy, Jennifer Garvey Berger, Bill Torbert, Suzanne Cook-Reuter, I could go on. In integral theory, we use their models and say, okay, this is the upper left quadrant, and let's use that. But if you're in the adult development space, you're actually, if you're also in the adult development space, you're focused on your clients, your individuals, maybe your community and society. And so there's just so much focus in there, how to meet people where they're at, how to help people who where they're at developmentally just become more skillful there, accept where they're at. You know, Don Beck, who was not an adult development professional, but he would say, you know, people have a right to be who they are. That's a core premise. And then there's another dimension of, and how do we help people grow, give them the scaffoldings to grow? And I think the adult development community of coaches and consultants has been learning to do that in organizations. I don't think we've given much attention to how to do that as a society.
Yeah.
That's what Lene Rachel Andersen's work, drawing on the Nordic experience, raises as a possibility for us. And that's connects us back to mobs.
Yeah, she has that book. I don't know how to pronounce this, like Bildung.
Bildung. It's a German term, and she calls it Nordic Bildung. I think I've
German
got it
tradition of self-cultivation.
It has no English equivalent, she'll say.
Wherein philosophy and education are linked in a manner that refers to a process of both personal and cultural maturation. It is described as a harmonization of the individual's mind and heart, and in a unification of selfhood and identity within the broader society. Beautiful.
I think it's beautiful. And I think you did an excellent fact-checking service to us both. Yeah, they use it to describe how a whole generation or two or three of people living in Denmark and Sweden, maybe Norway, Finland, I forget how far it went, moved into the socialized mind. And I'm not the best person to describe this, but the important thing to say is it was a move from the imperial or self-sovereign mind into the socialized mind, where they started to care about their country, their nation state.
Yeah.
They started to see themselves as citizens of a nation, not just as members of a local community or village. And she also writes about how we need Bildung 2.0, 3.0, 4.0.
Yeah.
And so in the United States, that's like having a lot of the imperial minds move to socialized to self-authoring to transforming as a societal imperative.
So let's bring in a little bit of conspiracy theorizing. Some would say that those in power are not interested. They're opposed to the population, let's say, becoming self-authoring. And they want to keep them socialized because then you can control them, then you can get them to vote the way you want. So it's like the self-sovereign individuals who are the power seekers, who, you know, they
unilateral power seekers, not transforming power seekers.
Yes. The unilateral power seekers, which I don't know what percentage of you know, the politicians are sort of centered that way, but it's probably a lot. And
I think it's more since Mr. Trump got into the scene than there was before.
Right. And so you know, they're only interested in, they like the socialized mind people because they can get them to vote for them and do whatever they want, you know, including like riot at the Capitol.
So you're proposing a conspiracy theory to hold people down from growing,
I suppose. I'm really just not necessarily expressing my own view.
I got it.
There is this kind of like cynical sort of conspiratorial notion that the government is I guess it's kind of a libertarian kind of mindset that essentially you can't trust the government. It's filled with all of these self-sovereign individuals who just want power and self-enrichment, and they want to keep us down, so to speak.
Okay. Well, are you referring keep us down materially, or are you specifically referring to
Developmentally.
Developmental. Well, this is really interesting. I would love to see some evidence of this, because if you were to draw a Venn diagram of the people who are familiar with interior development and the people who are in political power.
No. I'm not saying they have a conscious, but they're not thinking in
Unconscious.
developmental stages. They just want to keep people tribal.
I see.
Well,
we might say that, yeah, there's probably a partial truth that this is just, we call it a brutal truth. And there are people in organizations. If I'm a certain type of leader in an organization, I don't want to hire people who are smarter than me. I don't want to hire people who are going to outshine me. And I don't want people to, and I don't want people to grow too much, because what are they going to do? Either they're going to take my job or they're going to leave to another organization, and I'm going to have to spend 60% of their salary replacing them. So let's just say I would say that it's not a conspiracy theory. I think there's all sorts of people who are threatened by others' growth.
Yeah.
But the biggest threats, let me just finish, Marshall. The biggest threats to interior development are simply not enough people who are aware of it and building scaffoldings for it. I do want to mention one thing that was a nice bit of good news. I can't remember if I shared this with you. But one of my recent pieces from the fall was about Timothy Snyder's writing on Ukraine and Russia. Timothy Snyder is a public intellectual, Eastern European historian at Yale. He's on the news all the time, brilliant. As I said, he's one of my, intellectual idols. Anyways, I wrote this piece using Kegan's framework to explain what I think Snyder is up to, whether he knows it or not, in combating Russian propaganda. And what I say is he's supporting self-authorship. And I do a whole thing on Kegan. Anyways, the cool thing was, through some method or another, he got a hold of the article and he sent a tweet out to his 500,000 followers, which then led at least a couple thousand people so far to read the article about development. And I'm sharing that because a lot of us are trying to expose more people to these notions. And I was very happy to see that happen.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's cool,
All right, man. Well, I think we've run out of things to talk about. And actually, we could probably never run out of things to talk about. But
we've hit a good stopping point for today.
Yeah, we covered a lot of fascinating ground and touched on a lot of really useful perspectives. I think particularly for people who are interested in diversity and inclusion, but that are looking for new ways to move forward that aren't so divisive or polarizing. And there's a lot of these conversations going on in the Diamond Approach and the Ridwan School, and I think you've done a lot of great work to sort of to further the aim of finding the most inclusive way to do inclusion. And I look forward to seeing what else you produce. So thank you for coming on and having this fascinating conversation with me.
It was a total pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on, Marshall.
And we've got to set those Jewish space lasers to self-authoring. So
you really are working that angle quite thoroughly, and I'm just going to keep going along with it.
Good. I'm just kidding, just in case we have some QAnoners watching today.
if the QAnoners are listening and they made it through 90 minutes, they've probably figured out that you're kidding.